Harold Henderson, and welcome back to Cliche Phrases. It's getting closer, and it all comes down to this final question, which is, what phrase is often used to describe the second entry into a long-running fantasy series? Contestant number 1.
It's about the journey, not the destination?
Oh, sorry, that's not correct. Contestant number 2. Nope, that's not correct either. Contestant number 3.
Zelda 2 is often considered the black sheep of the Zelda series?
That's correct. Congratulations, you are a winner, and you get to take home the grand prize.
Awesome! What do I win?
A copy of Zelda 2.
Hello, human beings. Power Gamer here. I guess I'm playing Zelda 2.
Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. You heard what I said on the game show. For years, this game has been debated on whether or not it's good, and it has that reputation for a reason. But before we get into the game itself, let's find out where it came from. After the release of the first Zelda game, Shigeru Miyamoto intended to make a sequel that was fundamentally different. An entirely new team was created to develop it, with the only ones returning being Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka once again writing it. It was directed by Tadashi Sugiyama and Yasuhisa Yamamura, with the music being composed this time by Akito Nakatsuka. The game was originally released on the Famicom Disk System on January 14th, 1987 in Japan, and the international release was delayed due to a shortage of ROM chips in 1988. The international version was finally released for the NES on September 16th, 1988 in Europe, with North America getting it on December 1st, where it sold over 4 million copies worldwide. Reception was mostly positive upon release, but over time it's become pretty divisive among fans.
Much like when I played the first Zelda game, this is pretty new territory for me. I've never played this game before, but I think it's time I finally put myself to the test. Let's do this.
1 year after defeating Ganon, Link notices a strange mark on his hand and goes to a woman named Impa for help. Impa shows him Princess Zelda, apparently not the one from the first game, who was placed under a sleeping spell long ago by a wizard. The mark means that Link is the one destined to awaken her, but he can only do so by using the Triforce. Now, in the last game, he already gathered the Triforce of Wisdom and took the Triforce of Power from Ganon, but he needs to collect the Triforce of Courage in order to awaken her. Where was the Triforce of Courage in the last game? Beats me. Impa gives Link a chest of crystals and tells him he must travel across Hyrule and place them inside 6 palaces. This will open the Great Palace, which contains the Triforce of Courage. Link sets out to do so, but unfortunately for him, Ganon's minions are after him because they want to kill him and use his blood to resurrect Ganon. There's a bit more backstory, but overall, this story's no more complicated than the first game. Go to the various places so you can get the Triforce and save Hyrule. You start off in Hyrule Temple and immediately notice what makes this game different. Instead of an overhead perspective like the last game, this one is a side-scroller. While the perspective is different, the core gameplay still revolves around exploring and killing enemies. The big difference is that there's not as many puzzles this time. While you're exploring Hyrule, the game goes into an overworld perspective similarly to Dragon Quest. In the overworld, you can run into enemies where you're taken to this battle area. The type of enemies you face depends on which shape you run into, and the environment depends on where you are on the map. But sometimes, you don't have to fight enemies at all, so it's just a complete waste of time. With this new perspective, Link can actually jump and crouch. He still has his sword and shield, but all of his other items like the bow and bombs are gone. You better get good at stabbing things, because that's your only method of defending yourself. You can still shoot a beam out of your sword when you have full health, but it doesn't do anything to the stronger enemies. Thankfully, it's a bit easier to hit enemies this time since you only have to deal with 2 directions as opposed to 4, but unfortunately, Link's sword is pathetically short, so you have to get pretty close if you want to hit these things. Meanwhile, lots of enemies can throw things at you at varying heights, and some of them you can't even block with your shield. The overworld is a lot more straightforward and linear compared to the first game, which I honestly think is a good thing. The original was too open-ended, but here it's a lot easier to tell where you need to go. I'd still recommend using a guide for this game though, because not only are there some really cryptic moments, but there is no in-game map. I guess they realized how useless the map in the first game was, so here they just decided to get rid of it. Even when you're in palaces, you don't have a map.
This game is pretty much the inverse of the first Zelda game. In that while that one was decently hard and insanely cryptic, this one is decently cryptic and insanely hard.
I'm not exaggerating when I say this is not only one of the most difficult games on the NES, but possibly one of the hardest games ever made. It is absolutely brutal. The combat requires a lot more thinking and a lot more skill. You can't just stand in the corner and pick enemies off. You gotta get up in their faces and bring your A game. The early enemies go down in just a few hits, but the later ones have tons of health and can even block your attacks. You need to know when to jump, when to duck, and when to do both. Yes, the most effective combat method in this game for the stronger enemies is crouch, jump, and stab. Basically hold down and mash both the A and B buttons until the enemy dies. But the other biggest reason this game is so hard is that enemies don't drop health like in the last game, nor are there any potions you can buy. The only things that restore your health are randomly finding a fairy in the overworld or by using the healing spell. While Link doesn't have any of his items from the last game, he does have a variety of spells he can use at the cost of some magic. Shield, which increases your defense, Jump, which lets you jump higher, Heal, which restores some of your health, Fairy, which turns you into a fairy and lets you fly around, Fire, which lets you shoot fireballs, Reflect, which lets you deflect certain things, Spell, which turns some enemies into blobs, and Thunder, which is a screen nuke. Heal is the only spell that's really useful. Shield and Jump can be effective, but you don't want to rely on them too often since they wear off as soon as you change screens. Fairy doesn't let you attack until you change screens. Fire and Reflect are only good for taking out specific enemies. Spell is just not worth it, and Thunder isn't obtained until the end of the game and costs an insane amount of magic. Thankfully, unlike health, enemies will sometimes drop these potions that restore your magic. Blue potions restore it a little bit, while red potions restore it completely. I don't know why we can't have potions that restore both health and magic, but whatever. The magic meter wasn't the only addition to the combat, though. The game also adds some RPG elements. Every enemy you kill gives you experience points, unless it drops a potion for some stupid reason. When you level up, you can increase your attack, health, or magic. You can't choose which one it restores, at least I don't think you can, but I do enjoy the sense of growth it gives. Leveling up is the only way you can increase your attack power, but you can find both heart and magic containers in certain places to increase those. The overworld looks really basic, but the side-scrolling sections are really impressive looking for an NES game. And while the music is well composed, the songs all have this twang to them that makes them sound kinda weird. Hyrule is also less of a desolate wasteland this time because there are actual towns to visit and people to talk to. Most of them are pretty useless, but some can give actually decent hints, unlike the old men from the last game. There's always an old woman that can restore your magic, an old man that can teach you a spell, and a woman that takes you inside her house and restores your health.
What?
And some of them have knights that teach you new sword techniques, the downstab and the upstab, so you can hit enemies above and below you. And I gotta say, the downstab is much more useful. The health and magic restoration can be used as many times as you want, which is great because, trust me, you're gonna need them. Because we now finally reach the game's biggest issue. You actually have lives in this game. 3 lives to be exact. Every time you die, you lose one and get sent back to the start of whatever screen you're in. And if you get a game over, you're sent back to Hyrule Temple. Every single time. Even if you were in a palace, you have to go all the way back to wherever you were. This is miserable. The overworld's not that big, but it's still a pain to have to walk all the way back, especially with how hard this game is. You keep any items and levels you gained, but your current experience is reset to 0. So if you're stuck on something, you need to grind experience because otherwise you will make literally no progress. So you have to run around killing basic enemies or find point bags which give you more experience. Problem is you can only use point bags once, so if you get a game over, too bad, they're gone. And you better be careful around pits because falling into them is instant death. And while the jumping controls are alright, this game has severe knockback. The core part of this game is, of course, the palaces, which act the same as the dungeons in the last game. Enter, fight some enemies, get the item inside, defeat the boss, do the thing that progresses the story, and move on. The big difference is that there aren't really any puzzles to solve here, it's all about combat. Some of them have branching paths, but for the most part they're pretty straightforward. Which is good, because again, there's no map. You only move left and right, but everything looks exactly the same. You also get a free level up every time you beat one. Unlike the first game, the items you get don't help you in combat. Instead, they help with exploration. You get a candle, which lights up dark caves, a hammer, which can break boulders to open paths, the handy glove, which lets you break blocks with your sword, a raft, which lets you sail to another area, boots, which let you pull a Jesus, but only in certain places, the flute, which removes this thing, and the cross, which lets you see invisible enemies.
While this game is nowhere near as cryptic as the first game was, it still has some pretty ridiculous moments.
You can only cross this bridge by talking to a guy in this obscure spot. You get the reflect spell by returning a kidnapped child who's hidden in a random area. Okay, that's just funny. There's an entire town hidden in this forest block, and at the end you have to use the spell to summon a temple which lets you get the magic key so you don't need to gather keys in palaces anymore. Some of these you can get from hints, but a lot of them are pretty ridiculous. On to the palaces themselves. Parappa Palace is pretty simple and just in the top corner of the world. It holds the candle, and the boss fight is Horsehead. You just need to stab him in the head. Moving on to Medoro Palace, which is in the swamp. This is where you meet one of the hardest enemies in the game, the Iron Knuckles. They can block your attacks with their shields, do a lot of damage, and take so many hits to kill. Best strategy is the crouch jump stab I mentioned earlier. Here you get the handy glove, and the boss is Helmet Head. Attack him to remove his helmets, and then stab him in the head just like the last one. In order to get to the next palace, we need to get the hammer. And where is it? Death Mountain. This is where the game really shows how hard it is. You have to fight a bunch of these axe-wielding crocodiles, and they do so much damage. Even worse, the red ones throw them at you, and you can't block them with your shield. It also has a ton of branching paths, and if you get a game over, you need to do the whole thing all over again. So you have to beat it in one go. No joke, it took me 2 hours to get through this place. It was awful, and I'm glad it's over. Now that I can break boulders, we move on to this beach, where you have to stand on this specific spot that lets you go underground. Come on, how is that fair? And wind up on this island. Here we have the Island Palace. You get the raft, and the boss is Rebenak. You have to jump on him until he loses his horse, and then he just becomes a blue iron knuckle, which is worse than the other ones because they can throw their swords. After this, you use the raft to sail across to another part of Hyrule, and go through this maze to find the Maze Palace.
This is also where I learned that every palace has the statue at the front of it that you can stab to turn it into either an iron knuckle or a red potion. Makes it a solid grinding spot.
Anyways, this palace has Wizzrobes, which can only be defeated using the Reflect spell, and they're nowhere near as annoying as they were in the first game. You get the boots, and the boss is Karok, which is the easiest boss in the game. Just stand in the corner and use Reflect. Use the boots to access the Ocean Palace, and here we have sorcerers which shoot fire at you. Yeah, I'm just gonna ignore these guys. It also has a fake wall. You get the flute, the boss is Gooma, and you have to stab him while avoiding his mace. The key is patience. Now you have to stand in between these rocks and play the flute to make the hidden palace appear. Hope you like invisible pits. You get the cross here and have a rematch with Rebenak. Twice. The real boss is Barba, and it's a pain because it has lava pits, so if you fall in, you're instantly dead. My strategy ended up being wait for him to pop up in the middle, stab him, and then jump to the right because there's no lava pit on the end.
That's the last one. Now it's time to head to the Great Palace.
One thing I haven't mentioned is that you can collect these Link dolls for an extra life. I don't know why, but that image is just funny to me. Thing is, like the point bags, they can only be gathered once, and trust me when I say, you're gonna need them for this. Making your way to the Great Palace is a gauntlet. There are so many unavoidable sequences where you have guys throwing rocks at you from behind a fence, and jumping over lava pits with these stupid things flying at you. It was insane, and I just barely made it. But now, I'm here. The Great Palace. This place is insane. It's absolutely enormous and filled with dead ends. Look up a map for this place. You're gonna need it. It also has the strongest enemies in the game. These birds that shoot fire at you, and these bird knights that are just like the Iron Knuckles, only they constantly jump and follow you across the screen. Come on, come on. No! You've gotta be kidding me! Now I have to go through that whole thing again. Hold on, wait, what?
I'm back at the Great Palace. I mean, I'm happy about that, but why couldn't it have been like that the rest of the game?
So, after doing some research, since this game was originally on the Famicom disk system, it was made on a disc with 2 sides. Side A had the entire game up to the Great Palace, and Side B had just the Great Palace. Since they didn't want to have people flipping the disc over every time they got a game over, they just made it reset to the start of the Great Palace, and the international version kept that. Which is fine by me, because if I had to trek all the way through this with every game over, I'd lose my mind. At the end of the Great Palace, you have to fight the Thunderbird, which can only be damaged after you use the Thunder spell, which not only means you probably won't have enough magic to use heal during the fight, but it also means you can't win if you didn't get the Thunder spell. Yeah, just like the Silver Arrows in the last game. He shoots fireballs at you and can only be damaged by stabbing him in the face. Up and down stabs don't work, so you have to run back and forth, memorize the pattern, and jump at the exact right moments. It took me an insane amount of tries, but I finally beat it with only 1 life left. But of course, that's not the final boss. You reach the Triforce of Courage and are greeted by Dark Link. He mimics your every move, your health and magic are not restored, and if you get a game over, you have to do the entire palace all over again. No thank you. Link gets the Triforce and uses it to awaken Zelda. The two embrace as the game ends. It once again unlocks a second quest, but I'm not doing that.
Game conquered. Zelda 2 is worthy of its reputation. While there is some satisfaction to it, it is absolutely brutal. I can only recommend this game to someone who loves a challenge. Otherwise, stay away. It is pretty unique for being a side-scrolling Zelda game, though. I wonder if the series ever tried something like that again. Nope, guess they didn't.